Shalom, and welcome to this presentation on YHWH's Timekeeping Lights, the Sun, Moon, and Stars, Part 1, by Daniel Fuentes, servant of YHWH. Let us get into the Almighty's Word. Let us go to the book of Bereshith, which means in the beginning. This is the book of Genesis, and we'll be reading from chapter 1, verses 14 through 19, to see what the Almighty says in His own word about what He has done, what He has put in place. Verse 14, and the Almighty said, let lights, meorot, come to be in the expanse of the heavens, shamayim, to separate day, yom, from the night, laila, and let them be for signs, otot, and appointed times, moadiym, and for days, yamim, and years, shanim. Verse 15, and let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens, shamayim, to give light on the earth. And it came to be so. Verse 16, and the Almighty made two great lights, the greater light, maor gadol, to rule the day, and the lesser light, maor katon, to rule the night, and the stars, kokavim. Verse 17, and the Almighty set them in the expanse of the heavens, shamayim, to give light on the earth. Verse 18, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And the Almighty saw that it was good, tov. Verse 19, and there came to be evening, erev, and there came to be morning, boker, the fourth, rivi'i, day. Let us look carefully at the Almighty's word and see the things that He set in place here. Going to verse 16, we know that the greater light, Maor Gadol, is referring to the sun, which in Hebrew is Shemesh. And we know that the sun was appointed to rule the day, and it does to this day. And also the lesser light, which is known as Maor Katon, we know that that's referring to the moon, which in Hebrew is Yareach, and is visible and shines its light in the night, even though you can see it in the day sometimes, but yet the brightness of the sun is brighter than it. So at night, when the sun has set, that's when you can see the moon, the moon's light more clearly. And of course, we know the stars are kokavim. And let's just consider that in verse 14, in speaking of the lights, which later on the Almighty in verse 16 explains that there's a greater and a lesser one. Again, the Shemesh, the sun, and the moon, the Yareach, and the Kohavim also. So that means that the Kohavim also have a place in what the Almighty is doing here. Going back to verse 14, He's saying that these lights have roles to play to separate day from night, and also for being signs. We know that the sun, we see its brightness during the daytime, so it separates the day from the night. The sun already expresses that. And then we know that the moon is associated with the night. Again, there are times you can see it in the daytime, but its place is appointed for the night, so that we can see it in the night. Again, for signs, because the Almighty does things with these lights to show His people things, and also appointed times. So this is so important. This is moadiym. This is what this presentation is really all about, is understanding how do we how do we follow the moadiym, the appointed times of the Almighty? Are we keeping His word? So here we see clearly in verse 14 that there's a place. It says lights. If it was only for one light to be for appointed times, it wouldn't say lights. If this was all about the sun, it would say only light. If it was all about the moon, it would say only light. But it says lights. So let us take that into consideration. We'll continue to read the word of the Almighty and gain His understanding. But I do believe that this verse 14 of Bereshit, Genesis chapter 1, clearly shows that the lights, plural, are for appointed times, moadiym. And we'll get into that in this study. And also for days. We know that days are reckoned by the sun's rising, by the sun's setting. We understand what daylight periods are. And also in the Hebrew reckoning, we know that, as we'll see in verse 19, it speaks of what we know in English as evening. In Hebrew it's erev, and that's the sun's transitioning into night, which we also know as sunset. And then it also speaks of morning, which in Hebrew is voker, and we understand that to be the sun's transition into day, which we call sunrise. We know that that's when the day changes, beginning at the erev and continuing on throughout the voker, and the continuation of that yom, of that day, until erev comes again. So there we have, going back to verse 14, the reckoning of the days. It's associated with the sun, the yamim. We see that. And then also the years, the shanim, as I will be able to show through this presentation. We will understand how to reckon these years, the shanim, which I believe and will conclusively show that is using the sun. It's very important to understand that. All praise to the Almighty. May He continue to lead us as we study into His word. And before we move from this slide, again, I will ask you to pay attention to verse 19, how it mentions that these lights came to be on the fourth day, fourth being Revi'i. So let's take that into account, that that's when the sun began its course here, according to the command of the Almighty. Just months or renewed months? We have to answer that question. We have some people who follow a solar only, so-called calendar, and they only use the sun to understand months, which there is a way to understand months with the sun. I'm not denying that. And they also use the sun to calculate their years. Again, I uphold that myself. I find that that is in the scriptures and will prove it. And the error that's made is that they treat the Hebrew word chodesh as if it merely means month, and then they apply it to the solar months, and they reject the lunar months. I believe that that's a great error that's being made. And we'll prove it through the scripture. We're going to look at this Hebrew word, chodesh. And again, I've already shared that it's partially translated as month by proponents of a solar-only reckoning of the appointed times. And that's a mistake that's made by those who follow a solar-only reckoning of the year. When they try to apply the appointed times, the moadiym, to their solar reckoning, it doesn't work, because they're neglecting what this word means. Now, the word chodesh is derived from the root word chadash, which means to make new, to renew, to restore, to be renewed. A solar month does not provide a visual witness of being renewed, but the sun is responsible for seasonal changes every 3 months or 91 days. So the sun has its place. A lunar month aligns with the meaning of Kadash and Chodesh by being completely dark at its end, that is conjunction, then providing the visual witness of renewal at its beginning, that is waxing crescent. And we know that. That's what we understand to be known as the crescent moon in our time. We know that we can see the beginning of a new lunar month by looking for that crescent that's waxing, that's getting greater. The visual witness of renewal. And we can also see when the moon is so dark that you can't see any light on it, and that's at its end, which we understand to be conjunction in our modern time. The correct translation of Chodesh is renewed. However, it is correctly interpreted as new or renewed month or moon. So our Hebrew people understood this, that when they see the word Chodesh, doesn't just mean month, it means new month or renewed month or new moon or renewed moon. It's all connected. We're going to find some scriptural evidence in Hanok that this is the practice that was understood at the times in the beginning. Before we get into that scriptural witness in Hanok, we're going to go to Shemot first. We'll begin in the Torah, Shemot, Exodus, chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. Verse 1. And YHWH spoke to Moshe and to Aharon in the land of Mitzrayim, saying, verse 2, this new, which the word there is Chodesh, which is interpreted as moon or month, is the beginning of new. The word here is chodeshiym, interpreted as moons or months for you. It is the first new chodesh, moon or month of the year, shana, for you. This is scriptural parameter number 1 that we'll be considering in this presentation. Let us see what the Almighty is showing us in His Word here in scriptural parameter number 1, found in Shemot, Exodus, chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. We see that in verse 1, it's the Almighty Himself speaking to Moshe and Aharon in Egypt, the land of Mitzrayim, and the Almighty is letting them know this new Chodesh, moon or month, they were literally experiencing it, they were in it. When He said to them, this new Chodesh, moon or month, they knew exactly what He was referring to. It's the beginning of new chodeshiym, moons or months for you. It is the first new chodesh, moon or month of the year, shana, for you. This text shows us that chodeshiym, renewed lunar months, are inextricably linked to the appointed times. We also see that the first chodesh, renewed lunar month, is when Pesach and Matzot are kept, and that there is such a thing as a scriptural year. The year, the Shana, that the Almighty references is the 364-day solar year, not the 354-day lunar year. There is no mention of a strictly 12-month lunar year, nor a 13-month lunar year. Do you see it anywhere here in verse 2? Does it say this new Chodesh, moon or month, is the beginning of 12 Chodeshim? No, it doesn't say it. Does it say it's the beginning of 13 Chodeshim? No, it doesn't say that either. Does it say it is the first new Chodesh, moon or month, of the 12 Chodeshim year? No, it doesn't say that. Praise Yah. To the Almighty be the kavod. These things are understood through the Ruach. When one tries to fit in 354-day lunar year for the understanding of what this word year says here in verse 2, the meaning of Shana. What happens, as we'll find out later on in this presentation, is that there's a disturbing of the seasons. So we know the Almighty is not referring to that here. You can't know it now so early in the presentation, but by the end you'll understand there's no way he's referring to the 354-day lunar year, because if he's telling them to do that, then he's telling them to disturb the seasons, which will happen eventually. He is telling them to align to the 364-day solar year. In other words, this Chodesh that you're experiencing, which we know is the Aviv Chodesh, this is the one that's the first of the chodeshiym of the year. Praise Yah, the year being the 364-day solar year. Here's the evidence in Hanoch that I spoke of. The renewed moon for months in Hanoch. So there are those again who follow strictly solar in their understanding of applying the Almighty's word to reckoning the moadiym, the appointed times, and they use the book of Hanoch. And I will show through the book of Hanoch that yes, solar, understanding solar, the months, the solar months, the solar year is very critical to understanding the times of YHWH. However, we cannot neglect these scriptures here in Hanoch that prove that the moon was also used for the reckoning of months as well. Evidence of the waxing crescent moon, as we know it, the crescent moon as Rosh Chodesh, or the beginning of the Chodesh months, lunar months, for determining the beginning of lunar months is found in Hanoch Enoch, chapter 78, verse 12. And on the first day, she is called the new moon, for on that day the light rises upon her. That's very powerful because we know that the moon reflects the sun's light. And what we see here is that this scripture is showing us that on the first day, the moon, the Yareach, is called the new moon, okay? Or Chodesh moon, Chodesh Yareach, because on that day the light rises upon her, which is exactly what happens on a Rosh Chodesh, that you can begin to see the light upon the moon. Also, the duration and end of the moon as a month is in Hanoch, Enoch, chapter 78, verse 14. On the side where the light of the moon comes forth, there again she diminishes till all the light vanishes, and all the days of the month are at an end, and her circumference is empty, void of light. So again, here we see evidence in Hanoch, speaking of the phases of the moon, how it continues, the light continues coming forth until it vanishes, and it associates the vanishing with the end of the month, the days of the month being over. Here we see evidence that the chodeshiym, the lunar months, do not begin with the conjunction of the moon, because there are some people who follow that belief also. They believe that it's a dark moon that they call the new moon. However, that's not what we're seeing in the scriptures. What we're seeing in the scriptures is that we're supposed to see a witness of renewal. That's what the word chodesh means, when you see the light again. And here in Hanoch, it explains that the vanishing of the light, the conjunction, getting to that point of darkness once again, shows you that the days of the month are at an end. That is the end. And the circumference is empty at that time, void of light. The moon for months in Sirach. Evidence for the moon being used for months and to serve in her season as a sign for feasts is found in Sirach, Ecclesiasticus, chapter 43, verses 6 through 8. Verse 6, He made the moon also to serve in her season for a declaration of times and a sign of the world. Verse 7, From the moon is the sign of feasts, a light that decreases in her perfection. Verse 8, The month is called after her name, increasing wonderfully in her changing, being an instrument of the armies above, shining in the firmament of heaven. Praise Almighty Yah. In verse 6 we see that it's clearly speaking of the moon, where it says He made. We know it's speaking of the Almighty Yah who made the moon and assigned it its responsibilities. And here in verse 6 we see evidence that the moon serves in her season, specifically for a declaration of times. And I believe this is referring to the appointed times. Praise Yah. And it also says it's used as a sign for the whole world. And we know that in the book of Bereshit, chapter 1, we read about how the Almighty created the sun and the moon and the stars for signs. Praise Yah. And He does use them for signs. Verse 7, From the moon is the sign of feast. Again, here's evidence again that when it talked about declaration of times in verse 6, it's referring to the appointed times, because here it says the moon is the sign of feasts. Praise the Almighty. We know that the Aviv moon, which is the first renewed moon, is the one that we then know how to count the rest of the scriptural year, beginning with Pesach, unleavened bread, and continuing all the way up to the last day, the great day after Sukkot, seventh day of Sukkot ends. So here, going back to verse 7, from the moon is the sign of feast. And let's pay attention to this. A light that decreases in her perfection. Now, we know that after the moon reaches its fullness, midway through its phase, then it begins to decrease, which is called waning. So this is speaking of the phases of the moon decreasing in her perfection. Then verse 8, the month is called after her name. Again, here is proof that we are interpreting the word chodeshiym the right way. Chodeshiym has to do with renewal. So the month, the chodesh, is called after her name, after the moon's name, because the moon renews itself. At the end, it gets dark, the conjunction, and then we see the renewal again at the beginning of the crescent. So here we see it's speaking of the month is called after her name, chodesh, renewal, and also we see evidence for it says increasing wonderfully in her changing. Again, the increasing has to do with what they call the waxing of the moon, from its beginning as a crescent and then continuing to grow until it gets to its fullness. So again, we see the phases of the moon, the decreasing, the increasing, and then again it says here wonderfully in her changing, because again the moon is going through its phases. Praise the Almighty. We see evidence here that His set apart people were given the moon, hallelujah, for declaration of times. The moon for moadiym in Tehillim. Evidence for the moon being used for appointed times, moadiym, is found in Tehillim Psalms 104 verse 19. Verse 19 reads, He made the moon for appointed times. The sun knows it's going down. Praise Almighty Yah. We see here that where it says He made, again it's speaking of the Almighty Yah. He made the moon, and specifically says for moadiym, for appointed times. So we know we're on the right track with our interpretation of the chodeshiym, the renewed moons, being applied to knowing when these moadiym, appointed times, are. And we see a clear distinction here between the sun and the moon, because then it says the sun knows it's going down. Praise the Almighty. We know that the sun has a purpose and a responsibility to rise and to set, to give light upon the earth, to rule the yom, the day. And that is how we're able to count our days, and that's how we're able also to count our weeks and our months and our years in the 364-day scriptural year. Praise Yah. And yet it says clearly, He, speaking of Almighty Yah, made the moon for appointed time, specifically moadiym. Thank you for joining me for part 1 of this presentation. We found scriptural and historical evidence that the Almighty and His people have been using renewed lunar months, chodeshiym, for understanding when the moadiym, when the appointed times take place. Here are some references that were used for part 1 of this teaching. I hope you'll join me for part 2 of this teaching.